I'm starting to record this, and I'm interviewing our speaker, Sarah Wassberg Johnson. And she's been featured on NPR, in The Atlantic, CNN, Atlas Obscura, and much more. She is currently finalizing edits on her book, Preserve or Perish: Food in New York State During the Great War of 1916 to 1918. She received her MA in History and Public History from the University of Albany and a BA in History and Scandinavian Studies, which I don't know a lot of people have that, but it sounds very interesting. She is, again, put together the Food Historian website, which she says creates interesting, engaging, accurate food history content for the general public. And she says something here that is near and dear to my heart. That is, there's a lot of shallow or even lazy food history on the interwebs. So this website is a reflection of both her research interests, especially food during the World Wars, requests from readers, and deep dives into correct food history myths, which I do think there's a lot of problems on the web. You can't trust everything you read, obviously. And Sarah is attempting to try to make food history more accurate, so we all applaud her. I am lucky enough to be one of her patrons, and if anybody else would like to support her, I encourage that, and going to the Food Historian website where you can do that, and she provides people that help her donate with extra interesting content. So with that, Sarah, tell us about American cheese.
Thank you, Dan. Wow, that was quite the introduction. So I appreciate it. Yeah, just a note about the factual history, unfactual history. I do, it's tough to myth bust. I do attempt it, and if anybody's interested, I just did one on French dressing, because you may have heard that the New York Times and a bunch of other places reported that the FDA deregulated French dressing. So I took a little deep dive there. But today we're going to talk about American cheese. This was came out of, Dan asked me, I had done a blog post on the history of charcuterie, because that's a real popular topic on the blogosphere these days. And I decided let's go a little bit more deep dive into American cheese, which is what we're going to do. So I'm just going to share my screen here. Give me 1 second. There we go. Yep, and just a reminder to everybody to mute, or Dan, if you could please mute everybody as the host. Okay. All right, I'm going to start anyway, and hopefully we'll get people muted as I go. All right, so I love this graphic that Dan found, so I stole it. It's a piece of artwork that a woman did for the USDA, and it's the United States in cheese, which I think is just fantastic. So when we think about American cheese, we probably think of this, right? This single wrapped slice of processed cheese. But we don't really get that until the mid 20th century. And the term American cheese is much older than that. So I thought we would explore some of how American cheese has changed over time, and also some of the factors that are influencing why we have such a cheese culture in the United States and why it's so different from other countries. So if you're a food historian, as many of you I'm sure on this call are, you probably think of cheese something more like this, right? This is a 17th century still life from the Netherlands. Lots of still lifes in the 17th and 18th century contain cheese. We have fruit, we have nuts, we have what appears to maybe be some wine. This is probably at the end of the meal, right? Which is often how people in Europe consume cheese. But that's not necessarily how we eat cheese in the United States. So I've got this great little illustration from Mrs. Beaton here. So in the United States in the 18th century, we have the cheese course, right? Which there's a little bit of debate at the time, the British style versus the French style. French style, if I'm remembering correctly, comes after dessert, and the British style before, or it might be vice versa. I get it confused. But so it's toward the end of the meal, usually accompanied with fruit or nuts, and is often in lieu of a dessert course. Okay, now I'm remembering the British is after pudding, right? So you can linger over your port. The French, it's before or in lieu of a dessert. We also are exporting cheese to Britain in the 18th century. It's not till the end of the 18th century, but I thought that was very interesting. And we're going to get into a little bit about why that is. And that's really where the term American cheese first comes into play, right? We're exporting cheese from the United States or the Americas to other countries. And there's some interesting stories about presidential cheeses, which we're going to get into. But all of it is being consumed largely cheese on its own, and or not necessarily as an ingredient. There are some dishes that have cheese as an ingredient, but largely cheese is just being consumed on its own. So here are presidents we're going to talk about, and let's get right into that. Excuse me, my hair thing fell out. So this is just a great little textual illustration from 1845 from The Practical Cook, which is outlining the cheese course and how you would place it. So this has got clearly French and British cheeses, but then it's also got cheese biscuits, also sometimes known as cheese pennies or cheese straws. And then there is butter and salad and cucumber, so you have some little palate cleansing things. And then this I found particularly interesting. You have shredded Parmesan in a glass dish, or you're serving it with Neuchâtel cream cheese, which is not the same as Neuchâtel cream cheese that we know today necessarily. That is the French Neuchâtel, which is a little bit different. So this is another later 19th century illustration of the dessert cheese course with a lot more desserty things, right? You can see we have candy, we have all sorts of cookies and biscuits and cakes in there, right? We have fruit, sugared fruit, one lonely little almond, and one little piece of cheese. But you do still see it throughout the 19th century as part of the end of meal cheese course. So why is the United States so consumed and consuming dairy products? Part of that has to do with the European colonization of the Americas, right? Indigenous America did not really have any dairy producing animals that were domesticated or used on any widespread basis. That was all introduced. The first introduction is with Spanish cattle in the 16th century. And part of what makes American dairy unique, I think, compared to a lot of European countries, is that we have a lot of land, right? A lot of land that's very well suited to dairy production, particularly in the Northeast and the upper Midwest. It's just very well suited. There's abundant water. There's good pasture land, including in areas where maybe it was not as good for farming, or once we get westward expansion, farms that were kind of played out were converted to pasture land. And so in the Northeast in particular, after the opening of the Erie Canal in 1825, and particularly after railroads and the Intercontinental Railroad, if I can speak properly, the Northeast stopped being the major wheat producing area for the United States. New York and Pennsylvania in particular had been sort of the breadbasket of 18th and early 19th century America. And that changes. So part of the reason why that changes is because a lot of that farmland, the soil was depleted, but also dairy products, even with refrigerated railroad cars, which we'll get to, are much harder to ship over long distances, right? Dairy is highly perishable, especially fluid milk. So dairy production tends to be more regional, and the Northeast really until the mid 20th century continues to be the main population center of the United States. We do also have an agricultural revolution starting in the early 19th century. We start to import specific breeds of dairy cattle, including this little illustration of a Jersey, which is my favorite, right? Very famous fawn-colored, sweet-tempered cow that produces very rich milk, but also other breeds like the Guernsey and the Ayrshire and things like those type of cattle started to be imported. And then also American farmers started their own breeding programs. And then we also get technological advancements in agriculture. We get mechanization of agriculture. It's easier to harvest and store hay, for instance, to keep your dairy cattle fed. We get commercial ice harvesting starting in the 1830s and 40s. So that allows fluid milk to be stored better. And this all just kind of before the American Civil War, dairy production really starts to pick up. So just a couple of illustrations. This is a very sweet little postcard of a dairy farm from Pearl River, New York, which is south of me. So let's get into these presidential cheeses, right? So the first one we have is the Cheshire Mammoth Cheese in 1802. It was made specifically for Thomas Jefferson's inauguration in Cheshire, Massachusetts. John Leland was a Baptist minister who had supported Thomas Jefferson. He was anti-federalist. He was worried about religious discrimination. He got basically the whole town of Cheshire, Massachusetts to vote for Jefferson. There was one vote against, and they threw it out because they thought it was an error. So he was a big Jefferson booster, and Cheshire, Massachusetts had a lot of dairy farms. So he thought, hey, let's make a giant cheese and send it. So they got milk from 900 cows in the area. They pressed it in a cider press. So it's about 4 feet in diameter and a little over 1,200 pounds. And it was, as I said, a political cheese, right? They very proudly stated it was made without slave labor or milk from Federalists, which I find fantastic. And a motto was carved into the cheese, mostly that said, "Rebellion to tyrants is obedience to God," which is just a great quote. So it went on a very long journey. Of course, it starts traveling in November, December of 1801 to make it to Washington, D.C. in time for the January 1802 inauguration. So it gets on a sleigh to the Hudson River, where it gets put on a barge to New York City, and then it gets loaded onto the sloop Estrella, which goes to Baltimore, and then it takes a wagon to Washington, D.C. Jefferson thought it was bad for presidents to accept gifts as if it was bribery. So he actually paid $200 to Leland's congregation in exchange for this cheese. It sat in the White House for 2 years. They didn't eat it right away. I don't know if they thought it had to age longer or what, but just this giant cheese hanging out in the entry to the White House for 2 years. And somebody wrote an ode to the Mammoth Cheese. I'm not going to read it. You can look it up. Brown University Library has put it online. But it's called the Mammoth Cheese because, of course, Thomas Jefferson was famously interested in mammoths and mastodons. That's part of the directive he gave to the Corps of Discovery, Lewis and Clark, when they did their expedition west, was to try and find living mammoths, because we didn't understand fossils and they thought that they were there. So that terminology, that's where that comes from, in association with Thomas Jefferson, but it kind of sticks for subsequent cheeses. Thomas Meacham kind of repeats this idea in the 1830s. He is a New York dairy farmer in Oswego, New York. He runs a number of very large, well-run dairy farms. He's a dairy booster, and he remembers or knows about this cheese from Jefferson's inauguration and says, hey, let's do that again. But this time for Jackson. So he makes a 1,400 pound cheese, which is even bigger, plus a couple of other like 700-800 pound cheeses. And the whole journey to Washington, D.C. is basically a giant marketing scheme for upstate New York dairy production. And he thought that Jackson, if he gave him this cheese, Jackson might better support dairy farmers in upstate New York. So it gets to New York City, or to Washington, D.C., excuse me, on January 1st, 1836. It hangs out in the White House for like a year. Jackson is kind of known as the people's president. So he throws one last party in 1837, right before his presidency ends. And he just lets the general public into the White House. And this cheese is kind of the centerpiece of that. So I'm going to read this little quote. This is from Pearlie's Reminiscences of 16 Years in the National Metropolis. And there's this great illustration of the great cheese levee. It says, after having been exhibited at New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore, it was kept for some time in the vestibule at the White House and was finally cut at an afternoon reception on the 22nd of February, 1837. For hours did a crowd of men, women, and boys hack at the cheese, many taking large hunks of it away with them. When they commenced, the cheese weighed 1,400 pounds, and only a small piece was saved for the president's use. The air was redolent with cheese, the carpet was slippery with cheese, and nothing else was talked about at Washington that day. So Jefferson, it was such a crowd and such a press that he actually left the party supposedly through a window, right? And people were not just taking individual servings. They were like, hey, I'm going to take this giant chunk of cheese home to my family. People had cheese in their pockets. Mark Twain was a reporter at the time. And when he finally got into the White House, there was no cheese left. And he was forever disappointed that he never got any of the cheese. But there were some consequences about having that much random cheese just in a room in the White House where people are cutting off chunks of it and getting it everywhere. So Martin Van Buren took office in March of 1837, and they had to redecorate that room because there was cheese ground into the carpets, there was cheese in the curtains, there was just cheese everywhere. It was attracting pests and rodents. And Henrietta Nesbitt, who is the housekeeper / household manager for the White House under the FDR administration, makes a joke that all of the pests in the White House are there because of this cheese. It's just the descendants of all the rodents and whatever else was brought into the White House by that cheese. So Meacham had also given a 700-pound cheese to Van Buren, who of course was vice president under Jackson. And that just kind of sat in the White House. Van Buren didn't do anything with it. There's the Panic of 1837, which is really the nail in the coffin in Van Buren's administration and why he doesn't get reelected. So there's kind of widespread depression and poverty, which continues. He managed that crisis very poorly. And in January of 1839, a beggar froze to death on Pennsylvania Avenue. So just steps from the White House, and Van Buren's like, all right, I got to do something, like some gesture. So what does he do? He gives that 700-pound cheese to the Female Union Benevolent Society for distribution to the poor. So he does not eat it. It does not get used by the White House. It's given away to the poor. And that's the end of the Meacham cheeses. So just some fun cheese stories before we dive in a little bit. I thought we would talk about some of the changing uses of cheese in different time periods in the United States history. So in the 19th century, we have a couple cheese pennies and straws. I have some cheese straws, some very creative cheese straws pictured here. It's from a Kraft cookbook. Welsh rarebit or rabbit was another popular one, melted cheese, sometimes fortified with cream or other liquids to make it more melty. Cheese souffle and custards. And then macaroni and cheese, right? Dating back to usually attributed to Jefferson and or James Hemming. right? Macaroni and cheese popularization in the United States probably existed before then, but they really helped popularize it. And that continues to be a popular use of cheese. A little bit different. The early versions are usually just cheese and butter and pasta layered in a dish and baked. Later, we get the roux-based bechamel Mornay style sauce involved. And then cheesecake. We don't often think about that necessarily, but cheesecake has been around for kind of a long time. Not usually made with aged cheeses, more with the younger cheeses like cottage cheese, ricotta, cream cheese, those sorts of things. So American cheddar, we have our own style of cheddar that is fairly distinct from British styles, right? Cheddar is named after Cheddar, England, which is where it was first commercially produced. I haven't been able to confirm this, found a couple of references that said it was made as early as the 1620s in the United States. Wherever there are dairy cows, people were probably making cheese. It may have been cheddar. Aged cheese, especially before you have widespread refrigeration, is much easier to keep than fresh cheeses. Also known as store cheese, yellow cheese, Yank cheese, and apple pie cheese, which is my favorite word for it. And then it gets the name American cheese because, as I said earlier, it gets starts getting exported to Britain around the 1790s, right? We're exporting cheddar cheese to the country that invented cheddar cheese, which I find very interesting. And the first print reference to American cheese comes in 1804 in a Kentucky newspaper. So that's a little bit about how it got the name, right? And then one of the first commercial productions of American cheese, American cheddar, is in Herkimer County, New York, upstate New York in the Mohawk River Valley, right on the Erie Canal there. Their first cheddar factory, commercial cheddar factory, is in Rome, New York in 1841. And that is, they start developing New York style cheddar, which we'll get into the differences in cheddars in just a minute. So New York cheddar, what is New York cheddar? It tends to be aged longer than other American cheddars, 8 to 14 months. It has a very sharp taste. It's usually quite creamy and a little bit crumbly. One of the nationally available New York brands is Macadam. Vermont cheddar is its own distinct thing, huge dairy production in Vermont as well. It is naturally sharp. Some people argue because of the terroir in Vermont. They don't actually come out and say that, but they're like, oh, the milk and the grass is different, and so that's why it's sharp. It's generally not as sharp as New York cheddar. It's a little bit milder, and that's because it's not aged as long, and it's usually white. Cheddar cheese in the United States has a history of being colored with annatto, which is a natural orange, yellowy color. And you see it often also in coloring butter or particularly margarine in the 20th century. And sometimes that was to cover up maybe not very good milk, but it becomes kind of a thing. Americans, we like our cheddar cheese to be orange generally. Although white cheddar has seen a resurgence in recent years. And then Cabot is probably the most famous today of the Vermont cheese brands. And then there's Wisconsin cheddar. Wisconsin is our other big dairy producing area. If you're a fan of the Green Bay Packers, fans are called cheeseheads. That's because of the prevalence of dairying and cheese production in Wisconsin. Part of that is because Wisconsin is settled a little bit later than New York and Vermont, more toward the middle to the end of the 19th century. And so I think there's a lot more of people taking advantage of mechanization in Wisconsin, which we'll talk about a little bit later. But Wisconsin cheddar is usually a lot milder. It's not aged for as long, and it is usually orange. And probably the most famous national brand for Wisconsin is Land O'Lakes. So I have this little vintage, sadly undated, but looks like it's maybe 1960-ish. Advertisement for Land O'Lakes, and they have some processed American and pimento cheese. They have cream cheese, and then they have these cheese spreads. Ironically, they don't have any natural cheddar, but hey, it's the 60s. Okay, so let's talk about some of the other kind of more distinctly American cheeses, right? Probably the most famous and probably most underappreciated is Monterey Jack. It is one of the oldest American cheeses, first made in the 16th century at Spanish missions by Franciscan friars. Obviously, they brought cattle with them, dairy cattle, and they are making essentially something called queso del país, just like a country cheese. And there are multiple possible origin stories that I found. One of the stories behind the name is that the production of Monterey Jack used a cheese press called a house jack. There are a couple of Spanish purveyors in the 19th century, but the one who really is cited in almost every article I found about Monterey Jack is David Jack, who's American dairyman, and who I think harnessed, he was probably not the first person to make it, but really the first person to market it on any large scale. And then from Monterey Jack, we get a number of varieties, most famously pepper jack, Colby Jack, which is a mixture of Colby and Monterey Jack and dry Jack. And if you are a fan of Mexican / Tex-Mex food, you know that the very best cheese for making quesadillas or any kind of thing is Monterey Jack. Has a higher fat content and it melts better than a lot of other cheeses. So another one is brick cheese. I could not find a decent picture, which is why I have this press instead, this 19th century press. Brick cheese is invented in Wisconsin by Swiss immigrant John Jossi. He emigrated to Dodge County, Wisconsin, and started a Limburger factory, right? A lot of our cheese inventors start out recreating European cheeses in the United States. And he noticed that there were some changes to the process that resulted in brick cheese, right around 1875. If he changed some of the processes in making Limburger, he got a milder, less stinky cheese. It's called brick for two reasons. One is that it's pressed in a brick-shaped box, and the other is that in the early days, the weight that they used was bricks, right? So it's an orange cheese that's square-shaped. It's a little bit softer than cheddar. It has a different flavor profile. Sometimes it has very small holes in it, sort of like Swiss, but much softer and creamier. And it's the bacteria that they use in it is Bacterium linens, which is the same as they use in Pont l'Evêque and Limburger, but they use much less of it, which I think is what gives it that milder taste. All right, another one is Colby, named after Colby, Wisconsin, where it was invented. Ambrose and Susan Steinwand opened a cheese factory in Colby in 1882. And their son, Joseph, pictured here in 1885, washed one batch of cheddar with cold water. And there's debate over whether or not that was an accident. Apparently, I'm inclined to think not. Apparently, he was interested in cheese making and was actively looking for new varieties to create. So Colby is basically cheddar that is washed with cold water, and then it skips the cheddaring process. Cheddaring process is where you cut the curd into blocks and you stack them on top of each other, and you have to like keep restacking, and that helps press out the whey. Colby skips that. And it becomes very popular in part because of it skips the cheddaring process. It's a little bit easier to manufacture, but also because the taste, it's very, very mild. It's a little bit softer cheese, but not necessarily like as soft as like an aged cheese like brie or camembert or anything. So it's generally not used in cooking. It's generally just eaten as it is, but it becomes very popular for that reason. So I wanted to take a little aside because I live in New York and because dairy features a little bit in my book, to talk about dairying in New York, because it's a little bit distinct, I think, from other states. So Orange County, where I live, in the southern Hudson Valley, was a major dairying hub in the late 19th century and early 20th century, in large part because of its proximity to New York City. Rockland County also, but definitely Orange County, very well suited land-wise. Like I said, close to New York City, which was a huge consumer of dairy products. And a number of interesting developments in cheese history happened in Orange County. Herkimer County, as we talked about earlier, also a huge cheese producing region, particularly Rome, New York, which is just north of Utica. Cuba, New York, which is in the Binghamton area, also very famous producer of cheese. If any of you are familiar with Laura Ingalls Wilder, Pa Ingalls, Charles Ingalls was originally from Cuba, New York. And then of course, New York City is, like I said, the main consumer. And I have an image here of Borden's condensed milk. If you are familiar with Borden, you know that Gail Borden invented it in Texas. However, the Hudson Valley of New York became headquarters of Borden in the turn of the 20th century. And New York City, they were fluid milk purveyors in New York City. So they made condensed milk, but they were also fluid milk purveyors. They did things like ice cream and stuff. And so they are purchasing from milk dealers throughout the Hudson Valley in New York State. So just an interesting little aside that I wanted to include. All right, so we talked a little bit about the production of these various cheeses. You may have noticed that a lot of them are being invented in the latter half of the 19th century. And a lot of that has to do with advances that are being made in dairying. So we've already established that the United States is very well suited, particularly in the Northeast, to raising dairy cattle. But we also have a number of technological advancements that make dairying on a large scale easier and more cost effective. So starting in the 1890s, we start to get mechanical milking. There's also the development of a lot of machinery associated with milking. So we get cream separators, like this one published here, although this is a Swedish version. You get big steel holding tanks. We get steam cleaning, right? There's a lot of interest in sanitation, which we'll get to in a minute. And then there's also the development of trucking. So instead of, taking your milk cans, your room temperature milk cans by wagon to the railroad depot, where they go on initially unrefrigerated and then later refrigerated railroad cars to the dairy, we start to get trucking, which is faster and can be more frequent. We also have interest in sanitation, right? In the late 19th century, we're starting to understand germ theory. We're starting to get increasingly concerned about sanitation. There are a number of scandals involving milk, particularly the swill milk scandal in the 1860s and 70s. And then in the 20th century, the turn of the 20th century, we start to get pasteurization. That is not widely adopted really until the 1920s. The standard at the turn of the 20th century for milk was that it was all raw milk. So sanitation becomes a big issue. And there's a lot of advertising and rhetoric around like pure country milk, as opposed to these kind of horrible urban dairies that were a specter of the mid 19th century that kind of stayed over milk really until we get pasteurization. Refrigeration, we have commercial ice harvesting from the 1840s on, but we start to get electric refrigeration in the early 20th century, particularly the 1920s and 30s, which makes it much easier to keep some of those younger cheeses, which we'll talk about. And then from an agricultural perspective, we also get cooperation, as in dairy co-ops, right? Which is where the farmers are controlling the processing of their milk product. And that was a big issue in the early 20th century, with farmers being taken advantage of by fluid milk purveyors and dairy cheese factories and things like that. So you start to get a lot more farmer cooperation. And then also you start to get some state and national standards and grading in the early 20th century, and that continues to today. So this is an example of how milk used to be shipped. This is about 1910, the Trumptown Historical Society in upstate New York. So this is in wintertime. They've got all of their milk cans. They could also be cream cans, depending. And they're going to be taken by sleigh to either directly to a cheese factory or to the railroad station to be shipped. Okay, so we're in the 20th century now. How are people eating cheese? How has cheese consumption changed since the mid 19th century? And this is going to be kind of a lot. So sandwiches get to be really popular at the turn of the 20th century. Tea sandwiches, picnics, lunches, all sorts of things. So we have cream cheese. You start to get grilled or broiled cheese sandwiches. Pimento cheese becomes a thing. Cheese burgers start to be consumed. We also have cheese in salads. So cottage cheese and then shredded cheese and gelatin-based salads. There's a big fad of cheese balls, like tiny cheese balls as a garnish for salads, and then also just general toppings. We're stuffing cheese in everything: celery, tomatoes, bell peppers. We're using cheese as an ingredient in breads, particularly quick breads, and in pie crusts, right? Apple pie with cheese. Instead of putting cheese on top, people start to put it right in the crust. And then we also have meat substitutes, both for vegetarians, the burgeoning vegetarian community, and health-based community. John Harvey Kellogg, for instance, is a vegetarian. They published vegetarian recipes in their cookbooks. So you get mock sausages, cheese patties, you get cheese-based casseroles, macaroni and cheese starts to see a little bit of a resurgence. And then we're using cheese in dessert still, but not a ton. Cheesecake and especially cream cheese starts to be used in fruit-based desserts and pies and things like that. So just a couple of illustrations. This is broiled eggplant with a stuffed tomato on top and this beautiful little ribbon of cheese sauce over top. This again is from a book from my collection, the Cheese Cookbook, 1942, published by the Kraft company. And then this one, interestingly, in 1942, this is still being called a dessert tray, right? So you have this this red waxed Edam cheese that has been cut to look kind of like a tomato, which I find interesting. And then you have some American cheeses, right? But also some more European cheeses. This is probably cream cheese here in the corner. So let's talk about cream cheese. Philadelphia cream cheese. Not from Philadelphia, as many of you probably know this story. William Lawrence in Chester, New York, which is just down the road from me, another Orange County guy, is trying to recreate Neufchâtel, the French soft aged cheese, and ends up instead with cream cheese, which he calls Neufchâtel. And if you see in the grocery stores, like third less fat cream cheese is usually still called Neufchâtel. And in 1880, they decided to rename it Philadelphia. So there were a number of dairy farms in Pennsylvania. The Philadelphia name, dairy from Philadelphia, had kind of become associated with high sanitation standards and high quality standards. So they kind of like jump on that bandwagon and call it Philadelphia brand cream cheese, but it's not from Philadelphia. It's from Chester, New York, here in the Hudson Valley. In 1928, the Philadelphia brand was bought by Kraft Phoenix, which we'll get into a little bit later. And then it continues to be made by Kraft to this day. So this is an advertisement from 1948, a magazine advertisement for Philadelphia brand cream cheese, but it's the Kraft Foods company. We also have Velveeta Crumbs, which is, I think, no longer produced. It's hard to say. Somebody might be producing it still, but production stopped several years ago. Again, there's the Monroe Cheese Company in Monroe, New York, which is literally right next door to Chester. Big cheese producing area along the Erie Railroad corridor in Orange County, New York here. In 1889, one of the owners of the Monroe Cheese Company also owned a deli in New York City, and he had been trying to import something called Bismarck cheese. I haven't been able to find out what that actually was, but he was trying to import it from Europe. It was like a soft cheese, and it would always be spoiled by the time it got there. So he challenged the cheesemakers at the Monroe Cheese Company to come up with Bismarck cheese to try and invent it here in the United States. So one of their prime cheesemakers was Emil Frey, pictured here, who was a Swiss immigrant. And he ends up developing something very similar to Bismarck cheese that they call Liederkranz. I've seen it referenced as deodorized Limburger. So it's kind of a soft spreadable cheese, but I saw one reference that said, women like it, which just made me some commentary on gender and consumption and strong flavored things. And it was named after the famous New York City choir, a German-American choir, I think to reflect that it was supposed to be kind of, it's inspired by this German style cheese. In 1929, they are purchased by Borden, and Emil Frey continues to work for Borden until his retirement in 1938. So Emil, that was not his only cheese that he invented. Also working for the Monroe Cheese Company, one of their cheese production companies, I believe in Pennsylvania, not super sure, kept producing split and broken wheels of Swiss. And they didn't want to waste it, right? You can't sell a split or broken wheel of cheese. They're like, what else are we going to do with this? So Emil Frey is kind of tasked with coming up with what can we do with this cheese that we can't sell. So in 1918, he basically takes these natural cheese scraps that can't be sold, and he melts it with other dairy products and reforms it, and it makes a velvety soft cheese, which becomes known as Velveeta. They formed the Velveeta Cheese Company in 1923 as a split off of the Monroe Cheese Company, and that split off company is purchased by Kraft in 1927. And we're getting to Kraft, don't worry. James L. Kraft, right? He's kind of this giant in American cheese history because he essentially invents and popularizes what we know American cheese to be today, which is a pasteurized processed cheese, right? So he starts out as an Ontario dairy farmer. He's Canadian. And he attends the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, which of course is the World's Fair, but it's also an agricultural fair. There's an entire cheese hall. He goes there curious about, advances in cheese production. And he says this: no matter how wholesome it was when it left the manufacturer, it often reached the market in a state of extinct virtue, right? So he's in this cheese hall. Some of these cheeses are months. It's been months since they left the manufacturer. They're not in good shape. And he decides, okay, how can we make cheese last longer, right? How can we help prevent it from spoiling? So in 1902, he moves to the United States and he gets into the cheese retailing business, moving to either Chicago or Buffalo. Again, I've seen conflicting sources. I think he moves to Buffalo, but ends up working in Chicago for a cheese concern. One of the stories I saw said he came back to Buffalo from Chicago to find that the other partners had dissolved the business without him. So he kind of had to continue on his own, but he ends up being very successful. By 1912, they open headquarters in New York City. By 1914, they're selling 31 different varieties of cheese, but he keeps on working on this technique. He wants to figure out a way to make cheese more shelf stable. And he does in 1915. And in 1916, he files a patent for processed cheese. That is a patent he defends multiple times, which we'll talk about. So 1916 is a great time to file a patent for your processed cheese, because what happens in 1917, the United States joins the First World War. And as part of that, Kraft gets a government contract for 25 million tins of their processed cheese for use by soldiers overseas. And I think the government is interested in it because it's not going to spoil. Cheese was starting to be considered a good high protein alternative to meat at this time. And of course, cheese is delicious. Everybody loves cheese. So that really gives him a big boost, him and the company a big boost, although they were already successful at that point. In 1924, they shift the company name from J.L. Kraft and Brothers to the Kraft Cheese Company. In 1927, they purchased Velveeta. He never went after Emil Freyer, the Monroe Cheese Company, for a patent violation. He does go after some other people later, though. In 1928, he purchases the Phoenix Cheese Company, which included Philadelphia cream cheese. 1937, they developed Kraft Dinner. 1950, Kraft Singles, right, which is what most Americans associate with American cheese. And then in 52, 53, Cheese Whiz. So this is just an example. It's a great inexpensive protein dish. This cheese fondue you make with Kraft American, except for that doesn't look like a fondue, that looks like a souffle, but you know, whatever, we got this big brick of processed American cheese here. So these are all of the Kraft products that were available in 1942. Again, this is from my Love Kraft Cheese book. I did not include the last page because it was non-cheese things, but if anybody is curious, I'll just flip here to the page. Kraft does also get into, in the 1920s, salad dressings and mayonnaise. So they develop Miracle Whip, Miracle French, which I talk about in my French dressing, and other French dressings. And then they also get into malted milk and caramels, making caramels, however you want to say it. But so they've got cream cheese. They have these processed cheese spreads. They have natural cheese. They have all of their processed cheese and Kraft Dinner. So let's talk about Cheese Whiz, because I think this is a very interesting story. So it gets developed in the 1950s. And it's spoonable and pourable, right? So this is a little advertisement from about that time period. And Cheese Whiz is essentially designed as cold Welsh rarebit, right? So it's designed that you don't have to make Welsh rarebit. You just take it out of the jar and put it on, heat it up, put it on toast, pour it on vegetables, whatever you want to do. It's designed to replace that 18th century food, which has continued in popularity until the mid 20th century. So I just thought that was an interesting little connection. James L. Kraft always trying to figure out a new way to do stuff. And then there's Pabst. Some of you may have seen the Gastro Obscura article that came out a number of years ago. This is also covered in season 2 of The Food That Built America. So Pabst is a beer company, and they, like many beer companies, saw Prohibition coming, right? Prohibition is instituted in 1920, and they were like, we're a beer company, how are we gonna survive this? Hopefully it's not gonna be forever, but we need to have a plan. So the Pabst family had already invested in some dairy cattle. So they had dairy cattle under their ownership, and they thought, we got these big chilled caves for brewing. We got all the vats and stuff for brewing, all the sanitation equipment. Let's make cheese. So they make what they call Pabst Et, right? There's 4 varieties: standard, pimento, brick, and Swiss. They are all processed cheeses, spreadable, usually is how it's marketed. And in 1927, Kraft sues for patent infringement, right? I looked at the original lawsuit. Oh my gosh, isn't long and technical. As far as I can tell, the judge found for Kraft. Kraft won that lawsuit. But they allow Pabst to continue making Pabst Et. Possibly licensing agreement, not super clear. And in 1933, when Prohibition ends, Pabst sells Pabst Et to Kraft. Haven't really found distinctive evidence, although some references that Kraft continued to sell under the Pabst Et brand until 1940. But again, didn't find any hard evidence of that. So thought that was interesting that they sued, but then allowed Pabst to continue to produce it. There must have been some money exchanging hands there. And then Kraft continues to just gobble up as much as they can of these processed cheese companies. So, you know, if you know what Velveeta looks like, this looks very similar to the Velveeta brick cheese box, right? But it's pasteurized processed cheese spread. All right, so we'll go back in time a little bit and talk about World War I. We have voluntary rationing in World War I. It is not mandatory, but we end up with meatless Mondays, right? So Herbert Hoover, as the United States Food Administrator, implements a series of wheatless and meatless days, asking Americans to voluntarily reduce their consumption of wheat, meat, butter, and lard and sugar. And we had a fluid milk surplus during the First World War for a number of reasons, one of which is that milk prices went up quite a bit during the First World War, even as the prices that farmers were getting for their fluid milk went down or stayed the same despite input prices going up. So there was a campaign in early 1918, which is the second year of the war, to get people to consume more milk. This beautiful poster is one of them. This woman is wearing an official United States Food Administration uniform, which is just great. And she's got this giant bottle of milk, but also cheese. And this might possibly be a cottage cheese in the background. So they were trying to encourage people to consume more cheese, particularly as meat alternatives. You see that a lot in World War I cookbooks. In the meatless cookery section, there's usually a substituting cheese for meat. Cottage cheese also really starts to be a big thing just prior to and especially during World War I. And I'll show you a cool poster in a minute, but I just wanted to talk a little bit about the milk producers, right, the Dairymen. So this is a cartoon that was published in 1919 by the New York Dairymen's League. And so throughout the war, the New York Dairymen's League tried to organize cooperatives to get farmers to try and increase their prices by kind of holding out until everybody was happy with a contract that then they would all sign with a milk purveyor like Borden here in New York State. There were a lot of inquiries during the First World War, state and federal inquiries into the price of milk and why it was so high. None of them, as far as I have run across, ever really answered that question. A lot of people blame the farmers, but farmer inputs, dairy farmers were kind of lumped together with other farmers in the First World War because grain producing farmers and ranchers producing meat were doing quite well because of the high wartime prices and the high demand. Not so with milk, but their other inputs like grain were going up quite a bit. So this says, this is produced by the Dairymen's League. It says, settle the milk fight right, save the cows. Here's the farmer being gripped, right, by the fat cat milk purveyor, right? It says, living wages are all I ask. And the milk purveyor says, he won't sell me the milk below cost of production, so I'll kill the cow. And this is John Q. Public saying, but how about my milk? Right, and then these ball and chains down here says, less than the cost paid to farmers, high prices to you. So the Dairymen's League is blaming the middleman for the high prices. And as far as I can tell, that was maybe slightly accurate, but there are some contributing factors as well, like increased labor costs and delivery costs and things like that. So the article or the cartoon is arguing that the farmers are going to be forced to cull their herds because they can't keep overproducing milk. So in order to reduce production, they're going to have to kill their cows, and they don't want to have to do that. So interestingly, this is from 1919. There was a federal inquiry into the New York Dairymen's League. They were prosecuted under antitrust legislation for colluding to drive up milk prices. And that was kind of a landmark case that sort of decided after that farmer cooperatives are exempt from antitrust legislation. Anyway, just an interesting little political aside there. So cottage cheese, this is a great poster from the Hoover Institute. It says, eat more cottage cheese. 1 pound supplies more protein than all of these things: poultry, veal, lamb, pork, beef. You'll need less meat, right? So then you can write to the USDA for a little recipe booklet. So cottage cheese has ancient origins, apocryphal story about cottage cheese being invented in a Homeric Odyssey, right, storing milk in an animal stomach, and the enzymes are coagulating the milk into cheese. Long history in Europe. We have ricotta, we have quark, farmer cheese, pot cheese. Those are both drained and sometimes rinsed cottage cheese. But here in the United States, cottage cheese is usually dressed with cream and is salted and is just delicious. I think cottage cheese is very underrated. It starts to become popular in the 19th century, again, when you have a fluid milk surplus. Maybe you don't want to turn everything into an aged cheese product because that takes time. You want to be able to turn over your milk more quickly. Cottage cheese is a way to do that. In the Progressive era in World War I, it becomes a very popular cheese substitute. We are starting to get more nutrition science knowledge, most of which is predicated on our understanding of carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. And a cottage cheese is seen as a very good protein source, so often touted for vegetarians, and then during the wartime as a meat substitute. And then it has a little bit of a resurgence in World War II, which we'll get into. And then after World War II, it becomes like this diet food to get low-fat cottage cheese, which was a way to get protein, and it was, you know, a popular salad topping, things like that. So I think that's part of the reason why maybe modern people are sort of scornful of cottage cheese, because they associate it with deprivation and diet culture, but it's really delicious. All right, so some of our 20th century cheeses. Maytag Blue, not a ton of information out there about this, other than that the University of Iowa was researching ways to develop blue cheese from cow's milk, and they succeed in 1938. And the main thing is that the milk has to be homogenized, which apparently also speeds up the production process. It's inoculated with penicillium, which is what makes it blue. And it was an attempt to replicate Roquefort, which was very popular in the United States at the time. In 1941, Maytag dairy farms were founded. They apparently partnered with the University of Iowa, and they formed their first blue cheeses for aging in October of 1941. And so that's why we have Maytag Blue. That was very specifically from that dairy farm, and they engaged in a very popular mail order business, which is, I think, why that brand name is associated with American blue cheese. During World War II, the University of Iowa patents their blue cheese process, which includes homogenized milk. They actually try to go after the Danish, because the Danish also had a process of homogenized milk turned into blue cheese, Danish blue, but they had adequate documentation that they invented that before the University of Iowa. So University of Iowa lost that battle, but Maytag Blue stuck around. So World War II is a little bit interesting. We actually didn't have as much emphasis on cheese consumption in World War II for a couple of reasons. But you see, this is the basic 7. These are our first food groups, which I love. There's a whole food group for butter and fortified margarine. And the point of these food groups is that they are organized by nutritional content. So green and yellow vegetables is largely about vitamin A. Oranges, tomatoes, and grapefruit is about vitamin C. Potatoes and other vegetables and fruit, that is, carbohydrates and fiber. Milk and dairy products is, where's my thing? Milk and dairy products is calcium. Meat, poultry, and eggs is protein. And then breads and grains is also about carbohydrates. So cheese, notably missing from this. We do get one tiny little mention under milk and milk products. But that is because cheese is rationed during World War II. Milk is not, but cheese is, which might be another reason why cottage cheese becomes popular, because I don't think it's considered in the same category as those aged cheeses. It is often touted as a meat substitute, probably because you needed fewer ration points to get cheese than you did meat or other proteins. But it was still rationed in the same category, right? So here's ration coupons. It's meats, fats, fish, and cheeses are all considered together. I couldn't find a date on these, sadly, although now that I'm looking at it big, does it have a date? No, it doesn't. So I don't know exactly when this was in use. Rationing changed significantly over the course of the war in the United States. And it's a little bit confusing to keep track of, but cheese was on the ration docket at one point. Post-war, what are we doing post-war? We have the end of privations, and not just from the World War, also from the Great Depression, even from World War I, right? So for the first time in many decades, Americans have the income to eat pretty much however they want. Returning GIs bring a resurgence in interest in international cuisines, particularly French, Polynesian, and Japanese. There's a resurgence in interest in immigrant foodways that had kind of started in the 1920s and 30s, Italian, Tex-Mex, and Chinese. That really expands outside of urban areas to the whole country. We get the rise of fast food. This is a very early image of White Castle hamburgers. It's got Walt Anderson's name over the door. He's one of the founders. Again, facilitated by our burgeoning automobile culture and the Eisenhower Interstate Highway System. And then we get school lunch, which introduces cheese foods and processed cheese, I think, to a lot of households that may not have experienced it otherwise. We do also start to get some tension post-war between processed foods and natural foods. So European cuisine boosters like James Beard and later people like Julia Child are a little bit scornful of processed food. Processed cheese definitely falls into that spectrum, and there's some sort of elevating of these European foods, which are so much better. And so there's that tension from the 1950s, 60s, 70s. I found this great little picture in a local history archive. This is a New York Library Association. They did a program on the wines of France. So one guy's the expert on wine, a woman is the expert on cheese. And then they have this stack of books about French wine and cheese. So I think that's really interesting. This is from the 1960s, I believe. It's covered up by my doc. Hold on. Yeah, 1967. So that gives you an idea. That gives you an idea of what's going on and how people are kind of rediscovering these natural cheeses in the 60s and 70s as they're exploring European cuisines. Okay, so what are we doing post-war to the modern era, to the end of the 20th century, which is so crazy to say, but we're 20 years into the 21st century, so we can say it. Cheese sandwiches obviously persist. Grilled cheese becomes more popular. Deli sandwiches with cheese become more popular. Cheeseburgers obviously cemented as like a distinct American food. My personal favorite, and maybe a little bit more New York Northeast, the bacon, egg, and cheese sandwich. Cheese gets used as a garnish or a topping for everything. We're putting it on top of casseroles, we're putting it on top of salads, we're making cheese dips, right? As we get more casual, snacky, entertaining, there's beer cheese, fondue, nacho cheese, and queso. So many cream cheese-based dips and cheese balls, right? Fried mozzarella sticks, baked brie becomes a thing, mac and cheese becomes very distinctly American, assisted in large part by Kraft and Kraft Dinner. Our Italian food is very cheese heavy. Pizza, garlic bread with cheese, pasta, I already talked about, mozzarella sticks. Our Tex-Mex foodways are very cheese heavy. Enchiladas, we put cheese on our tacos. Nachos, very American with cheese. Refried beans with cheese, my personal favorite. So fondue obviously becomes super popular in the 1970s, a take on Swiss chalet foodways. That sort of becomes popular, but it really takes on its own thing And then also we have to kind of talk about charcuterie, which is the original discussion for this talk. We get this revival. The cheese tray returns. This is a late 1960s little buffet. And they do have a cheese board right here with all kinds of beautiful natural cheeses. In the 1970s, we get fondue, cream cheese dips, become super popular, like hot dips, cheese and crackers. In the 1980s, we're super rich and snobby. So dinner parties tend to have more like French cheeses, although that occurs earlier as well. In the 1990s, we get really interested in Italian peasant cuisines and Southwest cuisine, both of which have a lot of cheese use, but because of the Italian, you start to see kind of a resurgence in interest in Parmesan and Pecorino and mozzarella and things like that. And then the Southwest, I think, is when you start to get Monterey Jack and Pepper Jack and things like that get more popular. In the 2000s, we got real interested in wine and cheese pairings. And then in the 2010s is when we saw our revival in charcuterie, right? Although not just meat and cheese, now that term is applied to everything, including chocolate and dessert and all kinds of stuff. So what's the future of cheese look like? We don't really know. Is it vegan cheese? Nut-based cheeses are increasingly popular outside of vegan culture. Are we going to return to very hyper-local heirloom cheese? Who knows? So that's my talk. Does anybody have any questions? I saw some questions in the chat here. No, Lisa says, my son's take on cheese food is that if you have to tell us it's food, it probably isn't. That's great. Okay, I think I missed a couple other questions. Chris says, I think I finally outgrew my Velveeta guilty pleasure. I have to say, I grew up eating my favorite food as a kid. My favorite lunch was white bread with Miracle Whip and Velveeta put in the microwave so the Velveeta would get all melty, which I think appalled my mother because she's like, I didn't raise you like that. Like, she was not really a fan of super processed food. So I haven't had it in a long time. I feel like I should go buy some Velveeta and try it again. But I try not to be snobby about processed foods because there's a lot of socioeconomic stuff and possibly racism, sexism, all that fun stuff tied up in the proliferation of processed foods in our culture. So I try not to feel guilty about it or make other people feel guilty about eating what they eat. But definitely I love cheese. There are probably some anti-cheese people out there. I come from dairy farmer stock. My husband comes from dairy farmer stock. So there's a lot of dairy consumption in our household, which I feel absolutely no guilt over. So any other questions?
Sarah, thank you so much. Yeah, if anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat. That would be great. I guess one big distinction, obviously, about American cheese, I think, is that most people think of it as pasteurized or, that's probably the big difference between what we consider European cheese. And throughout your talk, I was trying to think about that. And one reason I think is obviously the size of our country and the fact that we had to transport it long distances. And the thing that processing does is preserve it. Obviously, if you go into any sort of European cheese store, you get a very small piece of cheese, you eat it for the next day or two, and then you go back to the cheesemonger. But Americans don't do that and save their food for a long time. And obviously, the cheese gets moldy. So yeah, I don't know if you.
Yes, I could talk about that. There's a couple of different factors that play there. One is that because we are a colonized nation and our largest population is people from other countries, the United States as a whole in general, our American culture, very not the same as Indigenous American culture, but our American culture is doesn't have that same how can I say this? We haven't been here for very long. And once we got here, we didn't stay in one place for very long. So we did not develop those long-standing food traditions around indigenous foods, around seasonal foods. A lot of other countries would talk mostly about Europe, but this is true throughout the rest of the world, have very distinct, long food heritages. That is not true in the United States. Most of the cheese that I've talked about has only at most a couple hundred years old, right? And other places they've been producing cheese for like 1,000 years or more. So I think that is part of it, that we don't have that cultural connection to our cheeses. And the other thing is, you did make a point about how big we are, but how we shop is also very much in play in the type of food we consume. A lot of other places the settlements are dense and walkable, and you have multiple food purveyors that are specialties. So you have your cheese shop, you have your baker, you have your greengrocer, you have your butcher. We don't have that in the United States, in large part because of our car culture. But we have grocery stores, which really start in the 19-teens with Piggly Wiggly, but definitely post-war, being able to walk up and down the aisle with the shopping cart and choose your own food has really changed how our food is marketed, how our food is stored. We have cars, so we're maybe traveling a fair distance to 1 or 2 locations to do all of our shopping once a week. We have giant refrigerators. So yeah, that changes our perceptions of food. That changes how long our food has to last. Definitely refrigeration helps, but yeah, I'm sure we've all had a bag of shredded cheese or a little block of cheese that got stuck in the back of the fridge and forgotten about. We find it months later and it's all moldy, right? Because that's just our American culture about how we store food and how we consume food, which is debatable as to whether or not that's good. But those are the factors that are kind of in play there.
Yeah, exactly. I found it very interesting, the fact that the quintessential, what Americans think of as American cheese, is actually not cheese. They call it pasteurized, prepared cheese product.
Yeah, so historically it did contain natural cheese. And I don't know, a couple of years ago, there was this fad going around on the internet, like make your own processed cheese, right? Very hipster thing to do. So nowadays it doesn't actually contain natural cheese. They keep it a secret what the formula is, but it's usually like dairy solids and oil and however else they're making it. Or milk, a lot of like Kraft, likes to tout that a while ago, a decade ago, they had this big campaign that, there's like 8 ounces of milk and however much Kraft singles or whatever, So, but historically, like Velveeta and like the early processed cheeses did contain actual natural cheese that was just then melted with other ingredients and reprocessed. So it was cooked, right, to make it last longer. But I'm not exactly sure when that process was abandoned, probably sometime post World War II. But yeah, it does not actually contain natural cheese anymore. All right, I'm seeing a couple questions in the chat I don't want to miss. Hold on.
Becky, go ahead and ask your question.
Sure. And actually, Dan, this involves what we're working on together. So I'm doing a Gilded Age cookbook, and Dan's helping me with the food styling because he's incredible with it. I'm thrilled to have him on board. But so I've been doing some recipes that they have an egg sauce, and I've seen that before, with a hard-boiled egg. And it's almost, to me, like, is that the precursor of to a cheese sauce? Because the one of them is called deviled spaghetti that you put in these little, they can be individualized, or they can be like in a bigger dish. It was served at Christmas time, actually. And then I just made a fish with egg sauce, and you make it like a cream sauce, but you add the hard-boiled egg instead of cheese like that we think of. And my son actually loves it. He's a teenager. So I just was going to ask you about that.
Yeah, that's a great question. So cheese sauce does predate the Gilded Age. It really starts, gosh, I don't remember. I have to go look at my cookbooks, but I know it starts during or after the Second World War, if not earlier. Oh God, I'm blanking on his name. The Francois Auguste Carême, I think, is the father of the mother sauces, right? So he popularizes all these roux based sauces in the late 18th century, and then so it's kind of French, these white sauces. The bechamel becomes white sauce in the latter half of the 19th century. And then Auguste Escoffier in the turn of the 20th century helps popularize that kind of haute cuisine French cooking again, in the United States. Although the Gilded Age, definitely they're very interested in French cooking. As to whether egg sauce is a replacement for cheese sauce, I don't think it is. I think late 19th century Americans they loved white sauce. They loved creamed anything, creamed eggs. You'll see often, which is hard-boiled eggs chopped up in a cream sauce. People put it on toast, they put it on pasta, they put it on vegetables. You'll see like vegetables goldenrod, which is usually the egg whites in a cream sauce, and then you grate the hard-boiled yolks over top. That gives the goldenrod appearance. So that's a great question. I don't think it's supposed to be a substitute for cheese sauce. I think it's just another example of white sauce cuisine, which becomes very popular and much vilified after the Progressive era, because a lot of people make terrible white sauce. If you don't cook your flour enough and you don't add enough salt and you're not adding any other ingredients, it can be pretty pasty and terrible. So it does get kind of
it's just funny how it's not like used so much now at all. I mean, this eggs, that's why I was wondering if cheese kind of took over, but I appreciate your response, and I thank you so much for
sure
that,
yeah, and that's probably a whole nother conversation about egg consumption in the United States, because it's ironic that our egg production increases exponentially in the Progressive era, because we start to get more and more agricultural specialization and commercializing egg production, which also ironically takes it out of women's hands, right? And so the egg money isn't available anymore if you're going to have a giant poultry concern. That really starts to happen in the 1910s. And so eggs become much less seasonal and much more ubiquitous. But yeah, I don't know why we don't eat more hard-boiled eggs and things like cream sauce. Why not? It's good. I guess we just lost it. So, all right, I got some other questions in the comments here. I don't want to miss in the chat. Okay, Lisa says, I've heard that you can trim mold off of hard cheese and it's fine to use. There's a lot of debate about cutting mold off of things and still eating it, but cheese is mold. It's in a lot of instances. So the hard aged cheeses I actually found, I didn't put it in the talk, but I found I was just looking for images, because I like to have a lot of images in my talks, and it's like the hardest thing to find usually. The story is the easy part. But I found one picture in the Library of Congress, and it was a man in a commercial, like a cheese factory, early 20s, like 1920s, 1910s maybe. And the caption was that he's cutting mold off of aged cheese in the factory. So I think, in our modern era, I'm a little more laissez-faire about this than maybe my husband would like, because that's how I was raised. He's very paranoid about things like mold and spoiling. But if you think about, cheese, yeah, it probably has mold growing on it. And aged beef, they're like scraping the green stuff off of it before they cook up your steak and serve it to you. So I think Americans are just sort of more protected from that now. So I'm not a food safety expert, so I feel like I probably shouldn't give you advice. But if it's an aged cheese, I do it. I cut off the mold and still use it. Okay, who else? Becky. So you asked your question about cheese sauce. Okay.
Within reason, of course. I mean, it depends on, within reason, of course.
Yeah.
This is Lisa, depending on how moldy. And I wouldn't eat shredded cheese with mold.
No, definitely not. And also the color of the mold, like if it's green, probably throw it away. But if it's just that little white bloom, that you get sometimes. I'll cut that off. Eleanor says, are there
Well,
any
again, I would
suggestions
like
for
to-
dehydrated cheese for bug out buckets? Oh my goodness, Eleanor. Man, I don't have any suggestions for dehydrated cheese for the apocalypse or bug out buckets. My advice would be to befriend a dairy farmer. And so when the apocalypse comes, you can still have your source of cheese, right?
Yeah, great last question here. Sarah, again, thank you so much for your talk. It was fascinating. We really appreciate it. And our next talk, again, our next program is virtual, February 26th, Jane Austen's Kitchen. And I look forward to seeing everybody there. Again, thank you so much, Sarah. And I look forward to seeing everybody next time.
Yeah,
Bye.
thanks for having me. Bye.
Bye. Thank you again.